All right, I want to welcome everybody to coming to our December Chit Chat. So thank you for being here. If you are not familiar, Chit Chat is an older program that GOCA used to do pre-COVID, and so we're very excited to be at our second renewed Chit Chat. And we are partnering this season with TheaterWorks on our speakers. So one speaker is presented by TheaterWorks and one is presented by GOCA. So it's a really nice collaboration where we only have to do half the work, but then also we really get to keep the speakers different, and there's not a lot of discussion ahead of time, so we really get to have some really different conversations without having to, in your brain, be like, who's not doing the same thing as the person we've already chosen? So it's a really nice kind of integration with our in-house wonderful theater crew. So thank you for coming. Our speakers are going to be Pheobe H. Boynton, who works in our theater department, and then Nikki Pike, who works in our visual arts department. So you really get kind of a battle of the UCCS brains tonight. So thank you for coming. If you have not, and you would like a notepad and a Chit Chat pencil to take notes, please do. So each speaker will talk for roughly 20 minutes about their topic. I'll let them talk about their own topics. You don't want to hear me talk about their topics. And then we will spend 20 minutes as a group. Y'all can ask them any questions you want. Please feel free to make some threads and connect some ideas, or go, I have no idea how these connect. Does anyone else have any ideas? So the last 20 minutes is a little bit less, not so much a Q&A, more of a discussion. So if you have ideas, it's a good time to have a chat. That's the whole point about Chit Chat. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Phoebe so that she can come up and talk. So Phoebe H. Boynton is a costume designer originally from Ithaca, New York, and is currently based out of the TheaterWorks costume shop in Colorado Springs, just upstairs. I won't tell you which room number it is in case Phoebe does not want you coming to bug her. She has her bachelor's in art history from Cornell University and an MFA in theater design and technology from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. So please help me welcome Phoebe.
Sound tech.
Yeah.
Glad to be of service.
He does everything.
Hello, I am Phoebe Boynton. I am the resident costume shop manager for TheaterWorks. And I'm here to talk to you all about costuming, specifically narrative costuming. The kind of garments you see on stage and screen. And we're going to start off here. So here are 3 examples of, let's call it, historical costume design. Anybody want to take a stab at when these are supposed to be describing?
Oh. 1940s? 1942. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good guess.
1650, I love that.
A long, long time ago in a fantasy world.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and the wonderful thing, we'll start off with the Princess Bride, is the author described it as a hot fairy tale. So it is not necessarily supposed to be historical. But you still end up with some really wonderful historical references. Costume designers take inspiration from all over. It is a lot of work to design costumes and to try and come up with garments that tell your story. So you can see here the houppelande that Buttercup is wearing is based on a 15th century book of hours. 15th century? I should probably look at that. Yes, 15th century book of hours. So there are historical references throughout the film. Not necessarily unified historical references, because it is a fantasy. And then we've got Elizabeth, the Golden Age. Many of her garments are taken directly from portraits of Queen Elizabeth I. This particular one is Shoreditch? No, Ditchley portrait from the late 16th century. So not quite 1650, but you were so close. And you can see historical elements like standing rough. You can see historical elements, not in the portrait like a wheeled farthingale, which is the structure that goes under the skirt to give it that wonderful box shape. And then we have Casablanca, which is unintentionally a period film. It was shot in the period in which it was meant to be set, so it is technically a modern film, but you can also see those wonderful period details that we think of them now as we watch this film. So it isn't a period film, but we experience it as a historical period film. So you've got those wonderful straight cut suits. The war was on, so there's not a lot of bias cut. You're trying to conserve fabric. People wear hats when they're outside, but not when they're inside. So, as a keep doing, we're gonna do that. Amazing. As a former art history major and lifelong costume enthusiast, there has been no subject in my life more vexing than the rabid adherence to the need for historical accuracy in costumes, especially in storytelling media such as theater, film, and television. This is not to say that you shouldn't do your research. Having a good historical foundation is an important tool to connect and understand the story being told. But when you take these details out of your story, you lose that connection, that relationship between yourself, who is viewing the story from a contemporary point of view, and the people who are telling the story. And that's part of what I love about theater, is that you have that immediacy between your performers in costume, whether they are contemporary or whether they are historical, and yourself in the audience. So you have that moment of connection. Now, that's not to say I'm not a period film girly. I love, love, love nothing more than to revel in the tiny costume details and choices that are made by costume teams making these wonderful costumes. And you can see these are beautifully researched films. The Duchess, the most recent production of Little Women, Downton Abbey, all very well thought out costumes. You can see that the women are wearing corsets in the 1860s. You can see the beautiful wig construction. You can see those wonderful 19-teens dress period details in Downton Abbey. But you can also see that these were made by a modern team. On the Downton Abbey red dress, you can see it's machine-beaded lace. It's not hand-beaded, and that was not an option at the time. So, and especially when you look at films further back, they didn't have sewing machines, and we can't really afford to hand sew costumes. And without knowing those details, you don't get the wonderful surprise of productions like Bridgerton. Bridgerton is meant to be historical. It is a fantasy of epic proportions. And it makes productions like this feel like an Easter egg hunt, looking for those period details and what they tell the story, how they tell the story. So you can see wonderful empire lines to the dresses. They've got high waists, except when they don't. You can see watch fobs on the gentlemen. You can see really wonderful jacquard texture, which was the height of technology at the time. But to us, it is commonplace and feels a little like a sofa. So you have these kind of wonderful details that tell you what the taste level and what the relationship these characters have to their clothes. I promise you the costume team here knew that this was not a period film, but they took great inspiration from contemporary and from period research. And creating that costume fantasy and giving yourself the gift of not living in a historical period lets you do wonderful things like this. Also from Bridgerton. This is Queen Charlotte and her kind of wonderful wig made of locks, meant to reference the 1756 portrait of Madame Pompadour by Francis Boucher, which tells you a couple of things. One, it gives us the fantasy of a world we wish we could see. It gives you a wonderful escape into how we wish we could see this romantic past. And it also tells us about the character. If the show is set in the early 1800s, her fashion is 50 years out of date. So that tells the audience that this person has a certain tie to the past that they are not able to get around. And the kind of wonderful thing about this is it takes contemporary fashion, such as the locks that we see in her wig, and it mashes it up with historical detail. And it's kind of wonderful to look back at past storytelling moments and connect both the period they are trying to relate as well as the period in which they are telling stories. So one of the best ways to do this is to look at stories that get told over and over again throughout the ages, such as Shakespeare. So we've got Romeo and Juliet here. Romeo and Juliet, a story that has been produced and produced and produced. Everyone finds a connection to this story. And the connection to the story changes as you produce it through the ages. The Victorians were obsessed with producing Shakespeare. They thought it was the height of sophistication. So you have reference images to productions of Romeo and Juliet from the 19th century. All the way up through, I think 96 is our most contemporary image up there. Does anybody want to take a stab as to chronological order? What's the oldest production up there?
Top left.
No,
That's a silent film.
So, this
that,
guy?
that one right there.
The bottom or the top?
The bottom, second,
The oval?
second to the right on the bottom.
Oh, yes, absolutely right. In fact, they go in that order. From the early 19th century, or no, late 18th century, 1796 stage productions, you can see that late Georgian, kind of that same empire waist that you saw in Bridgerton. And then we move through the mid-19th century, and then you have this late 19th century kind of explosion of romantic art around Romeo and Juliet. This obsession with the balcony scene, up through photographs and contemporary productions, which is kind of wonderful because this is a production that was written in 1597, and it's set in Italy in a time before that. So you have all of these people throughout the centuries trying to describe 14th century Italy in various ways. And they are all referencing similar material. You've got things like slashed sleeves, you've got a lot of hose. Even in the 96 Romeo and Juliet, where it's set in the 90s, you still have garments that have a similar silhouette to a 14th century silhouette. But you also have people who cannot escape storytellers who cannot escape the period in which they live. And that's just kind of wonderfully fun. And so you can see everyone has a different idea of what is important about medieval Italy and what is important about telling the story of Romeo and Juliet. Why, what period details do you hold on to because they are important to the story? Oftentimes you have Romeo dressed as a young athletic hero. And what that looks like changes through the years. And so we describe that kind of clothing in a way that feels appropriate to us as audience members. And as audience members, and honestly, as Americans in the current century, we love to describe things we see as archaic as Victorian. This dress, it's a beautiful Victorian dress. Is it though? Is it from the United Kingdom between, what did I say, 1837 and 1901? No, maybe, we don't know. And if, like many of my colleagues, you are currently trying to put up a production of A Christmas Carol, which was written in 1843, and you are looking for 1843 type or Victoriana type clothes, you can go to this wonderful, thank you, search engine on the internet called Amazon and type in Victorian. And you get wonderful things like this. This is what we think of as Victorian. Now, as a costume designer, we work with what we have. We work with what is out there. And so oftentimes I have to look at these garments and decide, how do I turn this into something that at the very least smells like a Victorian silhouette? Anybody have a garment up here they would love to put into a Victorian production of A Christmas Carol? Yeah?
I want to say a black one.
Black one, yeah. Yeah, that one, what is it? Women's black Gothic Victorian dress Civil War costume. Which is a lot of words that don't really mean anything altogether. And yeah, no, that is actually a really wonderful kind of description of what that period might look like. Now, it's probably made out of 100% plastic. So a lot of what I do is I go through and I look and I say, okay, if we are taking, this lovely feathered collar that looks like it came out of Burning Man last year. Well, okay, I've got some ghosts that I need to put, something that is both high-collared, which evokes the Victorian period, and also a little bit fantastical. The idea is that narrative is always a fantasy, even when you are telling a true story. It is important to be able to take these things and turn them into a story that people can connect with. We recognize those items up there. Those are things that are out in the world.
Maybe your world.
Maybe my world. Fair. You should go see Sense and Sensibility, and it will be part of your world too. So we often end up with things that are not necessarily period in period shows. Sometimes we put them in these shows because it's what we have. And sometimes we put them in these shows because we've actually come up with a better way to do it. So jeans have been around since the late 19th century. They were patented by Levi Strauss in 1873. They've been work clothes, they've been fashion items. I mean, Elvis was famous for having very tight jeans, and yet when you look at photos of Elvis and then photos of, say, contemporary denim, it doesn't look that tight. And you will also notice if you start looking back at your theater history, you'll start seeing a lot of denim in musical theater starting about 20 years ago. And it's because all of a sudden we have stretch denim that doesn't break or doesn't wear out immediately, so that you can have dancers doing jump splits without destroying themselves. And you don't have to put dance gussets, which you've seen up left, which are just not really lovely things that will let the pants stretch without ripping when you have an inflexible fabric. And that puts you in a position as a costumer of deciding, if I'm going to put Elvis on stage, do I put him in jeans that a modern audience wouldn't perceive of as tight, but would be correct if you came right out of the 1950s? Or do I put him in something that he can, kick his face with? And that is often a conversation that we have. The other reason that we put non-period items into shows is because of safety, honestly. There are so many things that we have now that we did not, such as rubber soles, such as zippers, such as machine stitching, that it becomes unusual and uncomfortable and oftentimes unsafe to put a performer into period clothing. And you'll see here what we do in the rehearsal room is, if we have something that feels unfamiliar, like a hooped skirt or a corset, we send them down to rehearsal so the performers can get an idea of how you move in period clothing without injuring themselves, without injuring the garments. And it gives them an idea of what period movement might look like in a modern context without being unsafe. The other thing you will see at the bottom of the screen is the dreaded character shoe, the bane of costumers everywhere. A character shoe is a very specifically constructed shoe. It is very easy to spot from the audience, and it is there for the safety of the performers, because that toe of the shoe will flex, the heel is reinforced, and it means that you can have dancers dancing in high heels, just full out, and they have something that isn't going to trip them, that isn't going to break, and will wear out in such a way as to not injure the performer. These are so universal as safety measures that they are in union contracts. And the other reason why we don't use period specific clothes in shows is because we love to talk about historical fashion and how dangerous and insane it was. Not to say that we don't have ridiculous beauty standards now, but in order to tell a story that, allows the performers to have bodily autonomy and to feel comfortable into their own skin, that, doesn't have a starched collar that had a history of strangling their wearers, that isn't a tight-laced corset that might damage bones or internal organs, that isn't dyed in arsenic green, which was a very popular thing, and also speaks to our ethics of today, that is more inclusive of body and human and culture, and lets us tell stories from the past in a way that invites a modern audience inside. So, in conclusion, when you see anachronism in costumes, remember that there are many very good reasons not to adhere strictly to period correct clothing, and I will leave you here with several images from J.S. Austen films, as well as their contemporary research, and remind you to go see Sense and Sensibility, and please Don't mind the zippers.
Awesome. Thank you, Phoebe. And keep those burning questions in mind for our third portion. So next I'm going to introduce Nikki. Yeah, Nikki Pike. So Nikki grew up in Black Forest, Colorado, where she learned to ride bikes and climb trees in between flashlight tag, midnight soccer, and competitive sledding. The adopted daughter of a nurse and engineer and one of 6 siblings, Nikki learned to work in groups and negotiate early on, fighting over measuring cups in the bathtub and wooden spoons in the garden. The Pike family children grew wild imaginations. Nikki is an artist and activist. She uses universally positive human experiences such as curiosity, music, surprise, and gifting to spread values of empowerment, vulnerability, and connection in the form of experience as opposed to product. Nikki sees herself as a cultural agent working together with local communities promoting activity and creativity. Nikki's expansive practice straddles public art, social sculpture, and service art. She has been featured in the Denver Art Museum, the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, and Art Basel in Miami, to name just a few. Most recently, Nikki's work has been collected by the Museum of Art in Wyoming, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and the CSU Spur campus. Nikki is currently Nikki's studio and home are in Denver, and she holds a principal professorship at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. So I will let Nikki talk to you about her work today.
Thanks, Lene. And I hope you can let Joy know. I'm just putting on my timer here to be respectful. So yeah, thank you, Lene. And Joy Armstrong couldn't be with us tonight, but for your great leadership at GOCA, and of course the whole crew that it takes to run the gallery, and like look how amazing the artwork is. So, and to the donors and supporters and everyone for being here. And Joy had invited me to talk about my temporary environmental installation, so I decided I'll talk about art in nature. But then since the invite, there's been a lot of things that happened in the past couple months, so I also thought I should add in the nature of art. So I was raised here in Black Forest. I'm a native Colorado, and this is my home. This is the snow we would get like 10 miles northeast of here. Here's the gang, my family. If you have seen Goonies or Stranger Things, that was totally climbing trees, bike gangs, adventuring, no supervision. It was great. So here we are in the suburban, and you can see the forest. We just had the plains on one side of the house. On the north side and the south side was forest. Big wheels, come on now. And so I want to bring it up because my father and mother, this is Jim's here, Jim Pike, and my mother is traveling back from Kentucky, Shelley Pike. They had 2 children of their own, and what's really special about them and about our family is that they could have left it there and had like the white picket fence, the American dream, but they didn't. They went out and adopted 4 children, me included, and took on the great task of bringing 4 other citizens to adulthood, which is no small task. And so you'll see in my work a theme of humanitarianism and service that comes from the very upbringing in which I was brought up. And so thanks, Dad. Thanks, Brother Rob. Brother Rob's here, Rob's the top right. And so here's the whole pack of us. The 2 boys, biological, and the rest of us scavenged. But the kind of childhood we had was in nature, and it was imaginative, and my father is an especially imaginative and romantic person, and he really built our sense of childhood and wonderment. We would go snipe hunting. Here he is sunbathing in the blizzard. And in the summers, he would take us chasing the end of the rainbow. We would pack in the station wagon and look for the pot of gold. And so it's really just full of imagination. And so I bring this up because it informs my work, and the first sign that I might have been an artist is in my 16th year when, as many teenagers get grounded and restricted, I found myself grounded for a month, and so I dug into my dad's tool shed and I sanded down, I found a grinder and sanded down my AMC Gremlin and then painted it like a zebra, which is really kind of a fantastic thing, except when you live in a small town, it's kind of the dumbest thing, because if you're trying to get away with things, everybody knows where you are. And so that, even though it's really is kind of a brilliant artwork, it was really not the greatest concept for what I was up to, which was undercover. So anyway, I wanted to talk about what Joy invited me to talk about, which is my work in nature and how the Black Forest led me to some of the work I'm making now. And so this is a series of hidden cabinets in trees that I started installing in 2009, and they're ongoing. And so there's this little surprise or scavenger hunt that you might, you could imagine that came from my childhood, like are the Keebler elves in there, or like, and so this one's in the city park in Denver, near the zoo. And here's, like if you're jogging down this path, you might see this door, and if you decided to open it, what you'd find is a music box. And the music inside is the music of local musicians who might not otherwise have a chance to perform, like at the Bluebird or the Ogden. And so in a way, I thought of these like a little music hall or music chamber where these sort of underrepresented musicians can like take the stage. And so in this democratic way, you can choose to open it or not, and then you get to hear your fellow citizens. And so here's another one in Langston Boyd Park, which is just north of there in the Skyland and North City Park neighborhood. And all the garage bands were so excited, and they got to put their music in, and we would all go around like on our walks and listen. And then some people didn't know they were there, and they got to like, what's behind the door? And it might be heavy metal, or it might be like someone on their cello. And so I modeled the cabinetry after, if you know, the cash register building in Denver. So I try to like keep it real local in the conversation, respecting the community. And so thus started, I think, some of my major work throwing back to my childhood in Black Forest. And so that led to Passage when I was invited, a curator started, or curated a show called Just Playing, and she wanted my piece. She invited me to be the inaugural piece. As you walk into the gallery, this is the first thing you go through. So I created Passage, which was my first experimentation with bark as a material. And so on the outside, you'll see the bark, but on the inside, you'll see like this glass window with a monolithic light, and it's slowly pulsing. And so it's kind of like this otherworldly, you walk through, and it's like technology and then nature on the outside. And so this is my first, that's 14 feet tall. You can see the scale here, and you walk right through it. When you come in. So this is my first sort of the foreshadowing to my work with bark. And I think what Joy was most excited to hear about. So I got invited to the International Festival of the Arts in Breckenridge, and the curator had this brilliant idea called Trail Mix. And what it was is mixing up our love of nature and then our love of art. And so 3 trails a year, a quarter mile up, they installed an artwork, and so you could go on your hike. They made it close enough that like grandma to toddler could walk up to this piece, and every Sunday they had a musician play. It was like really a fantastic idea of like art experience outside. This piece is installed on a retired mine site, and so as I was invited to make the work, I was thinking about how we extract resources and the value of nature and the beauty of nature and how this site was depleted. This is 8 feet, by the way, that's the curator, Nicole. And so I'm sort of trying to demand your attention with this beautiful form. A sphere is universally beloved, and the bark of a tree, who can deny? And so I'm saying like, look, like, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And so this is my first of my pure forms with bark skins, and it was meant to be contracted for 2 weeks, but it lived for 2 years. And when it was getting taken down, the locals were like, we want it, we got to keep it. And so a local person collected it. You can see it dug a part out of his property to install this piece onto his land as a gift to his wife. And so it got to live another few years. And this one survived about 5 years. And if you saw how I built it, that's kind of unbelievable, because I was also experimenting and inventing how you make these sculptures. And in a Breckenridge, in the high altitude with the sun and the snow, so bark is pretty protective after all. Even as I'm intercepting it after a tree's life, before it becomes mulch or decomposes, I'm making these forms. I was fortunate to get invited into the Pikes Peak Library District and the Penrose Library, where this, they wanted a sphere, so I lifted off the ground to make it slightly more visually interesting. And so this is called Virage, and this was commissioned right as the pandemic sets in. So it's like I'm installing it in January, right as everything, we're getting all the big news. And so I guess that was just before. So January is when they commissioned me, and I'm starting to install, and then everything shuts down. So this piece was meant to rotate through libraries in the Pikes Peak Library District, but it stayed at the Penrose Library. And here's Becca Cruz, who worked with me, and she's this fantastic librarian. And their whole goal was to bring nature into the library through art. And I got to be the inaugural artist in doing that. And so, and this form got used another time at the Museum of Nature and Science in Denver. And they wanted, they took a risk and made their first they bought and collected their first non-objective artwork. And so this piece does not reference anything in reality. It's non-objective, it's not meant to be abstract or sort of remind you of anything. It's non-objective, and so that is a big deal for the Museum of Nature and Science, where they're trying to give you an idea to think about something. So it really is as simple as a shape with the bark skin. And so, but they wanted it to be permanent. So this one is cast in bronze. And there's a secret surprise. They wanted an interactive element, because this is out on the east side where all the field trips come in and the kiddos show up. So they wanted an interactive element. I see my slides they kind of adjusted. That's okay. So there is a motion sensor that's hidden, and if you walk by, it has the sounds that inner city children might not hear if they don't get to go to the mountains, like the bugle of an elk, or like if you haven't heard a porcupine, you would not believe what they sound. They sound like a cartoon. I can't even explain it, so please Google it later, and then you will giggle till the rest of the day. But like a barred owl or other a meadowlark, so they might hear these sounds as they walk by and be surprised. So then I was invited to take my work nationally into California, and this is on the Lassen Volcanic Shelf in northeastern California, almost in Oregon. And the party that hired me, Ben and Danelle, really wanted a sphere, and I was like, please don't make me make another sphere. I'm over the sphere, you know. And I was like, so in the contract, I was like, sphere or similar. And so I was like, how am I gonna convince them to trust me to try something new? And so it took some convincing, where like in 2021, and I said, let's do a cube, let's go hard edge, let's just see. I think, you know, and so they said yes, and Ben chose this juniper tree. It's their private property, and they have the goal to connect people to the land. And so this is a campground where people can pass through as they're passing through from like California up to Montana's and the Dakotas. They pass through and stay here. So they envisioned a big sculpture park there for people to enjoy and connect. There's this huge 80 acres where you can walk around, and it's really a gorgeous place. But at the same time, all this is happening. Here's a picture for scale. There's a hidden component in this. You can't see it, but we created an opening in it that's also square. And when you look through, not unlike James Turrell, it's a little sky scope, and you just get a little pin snip of the sky, but you don't know that unless you walk under it. So here I am looking through it. But So as I'm making these arts and what I consider to be some of my most refined work after working for 20 plus years in the arts, we're in all this turmoil, right? We're in a pandemic. The political scenery is different, and I wanted to bring up the idea that the reason I can make art is because I have leisure time. And I'm privileged, so my basic resources are met, like shelter, food, water. And so if those freedoms are encroached upon or taken away, I would not be able to make art, especially as a female. And so I want to talk to you about the nature of art and how the artist is the cultural agent or culture agent, and what I'm trying to teach my students. Jack is one of my students. Percy too is that you can use your voice as an artist to communicate anything. So what do you want to say? And so at this time I was invited to make, there was a conversation, Black Lives Matters was happening, we have the new presidency, and public monuments across the world were starting to get torn down because people were upset they did not represent their community anymore. So leaders that didn't serve the people, they would, either the city or the public would tear them down. And so in Denver, they invited me to create a monument for Denver. What would you make? And I said, well, I would take that money and I would put it into the pockets of local artists. So I would make a stage. And they said, oh, we like that, but we can't have a stage by the Denver Convention Center because people will encamp. And I was like, well, I'm not interested in exclusivity. This is public, you know. And so I said, let me think about it. We're touching on some of my value systems. So they did allow for the performances to happen. This is Greg Deal and his daughter Sage doing their performance. This is Dylan. Sorry that the text is over, but Dylan Shalinsky, born Daphne Shalinsky, was incarcerated in a mental institution as a teenager to try to be regenderized because they identified as a male. And they were raped and abused in that institution. Later, just 2 years ago, the UN invited Dylan to tell their story and read it aloud. And so Dylan did that here. And Cliff is a man I met who collects local junk in the alleyways in Denver. But he's also this incredible poet, and he lives on the line of poverty. And so I just wanted everyone to have a chance, sort of the marginalized, underprivileged people, to have the money and the chance to add a voice. And so the way I resolved the encampment was I made this sculpture. I just adjusted the Constitution a little to say we the privileged instead of we the people, because we're the ones making the choices. And I made little prints of this in case you want one. You can take one home. They're on the back table. But these are the kind of artworks I help my students make too when they're feeling strongly about a topic. Here it is, we the privileged. Around the same time where we have the Dakota Pipeline coming in, protests, very intense. And Woody Guthrie's song came on over scrambled eggs with my daughter, and I was like, this land is your land. And I love this song, and I was like, ooh, it's still in English. It's not all that inclusive, and I was like, oh, we're not there yet. And so I kind of got upset about the song, and I thought, I'm going to correct it. I'm going to invite us to be a little more sensitive about the land and the bigger history of it. And so I made this neon sign, and it got collected by the University of Wyoming's Art Museum, and I also use my educator hand to sort of correct it if you rather have. There's a version of that you can take home if you want. And my students invited me to do a protest fundraiser for Planned Parenthood after the shootings, and so that turned into the Yes Means Yes, which I borrowed the text from Barbara Kruger, who you might know, famous 70s artist. She worked in text media and magazines, and she was interested in challenging capitalism, the media consumerism, and especially objectification. So I thought that would play well if I borrowed her aesthetics for the Yes Means Yes. I just took the No Means No slogan, and it's still consent. Yes means yes, this pretty dark time. So I was like, yes to the woman, yes to equality, yes to equal pay, and so I made this light box and various iterations. I don't know. Yeah, I have a yes means yes if you want it. To try to be positive in this era of like a pandemic and like rights being restricted. And of course, the next thing that happened is the Supreme Court flipped and Roe v. Wade. And so I got a little bit upset about that because I got to choose when I had my baby, and I have this gorgeous little 9-year-old. And but there are women dying who don't get to choose, and so I made this sort of like I hope that these pieces are a little bit snarky and fun, but also that they bring up the conversation about why won't men equally be involved in birth control, or at a certain age there's a different. This doesn't necessarily ring as true for 20-year-olds, but anyway, it's meant to be fun, and I have these two. Can you get in hot pink? There's big ones in blue, and so I like to make my work accessible and playful, and all the girls at the yoga studio want one, and so I've been printing them all week. And so I just want to end on these last two pieces. This is Chrysalis. Last year I was invited to Kentucky and I built my biggest work. It's hard to tell here. I do have. This is 16 feet, my biggest one yet. They suspended it. It's in the Bernheim Research Arboretum and Forest, and I got to live there with the fairies and build just like I was a little kid running around in the forest. And then my favorite piece that I've created yet is Ovum, which was named by the locals in Green Mountain Falls. And Greenbox Arts invited me to be a resident in 2023, and I got to create this piece, and my mentor came to visit, and here she is holding. Here's what's going on in my studio today. So you can see how this young child raised by this great family's artwork is inspired by nature. So that's it. Thank you.
I'm going to invite Nikki to stay and Phoebe to join so that they can
Accept it.
talk to you guys about the things and the questions you may have. I will start, since I know you might be processing some things. So one thing I noticed a lot with both of your talks was about materials. So thinking about like wood and bark and metal and text even as like a material, but also thinking lace and colors. And can you like talk a little bit more about like materiality and like how that maybe tells a story? Because really y'all are both telling stories through the work that you're making.
Well, and I love how you were talking about bark being incredibly resilient and protective, and the idea of like the material that you use being a tool to tell that story. Excited.
Yeah, and when you were speaking, Phoebe, I was like, you said machine run lace and then hand, and I got to witness someone making lace by hand, and I was like, we do not appreciate lace. And you said, all our clothes are plastic now, and that is sort of a devastating reality that our microplastics and like that we're not using cotton anymore, and I wonder how that affects
finding resources, as I'm sure you are aware, is a process of questioning how they got there. We do a lot of reuse and a lot of recycling, but knowing that when I wash those tights, there's going to be microplastics in the water. Is depressing.
What do you
it's
think?
A consideration. Yeah.
What questions do you guys have for the speakers? Or thoughts, maybe, things that came up in your brains?
Well, something that both of you talked about was shapes and how that conveys meaning and the little surprises, in your artwork. But then, and I was on a previous tour where you talked about some of the Sense and Sensibility costuming, where the inside of a bonnet, for instance, needs to be, finished.
Yeah.
So these little surprises that are in both of your works it's something you have in common.
Yeah. No, who gets to experience what's inside.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like
Right.
kind of wonderful.
Yeah.
I know as like working in a gallery space, there's so many secrets that you don't get to see, so you're sitting in an exhibition now, and there's so many secrets that me and my staff experience, but as an art maker, I always am like, no one knows what this looks like, or like Nikki's being like, you have to kind of get under that one piece to see the little sky view. I'm like, I feel like those intimate moments that are like, you have to investigate a little bit more.
Well, and how do you choose what little secret to embed?
Yikes.
No.
I mean, it is something about the joy of giving that gift to like, to myself, to the performer when they like discover there's something new in a costume, but also there's moments of discovery, especially wonderful on stage when you hear an audience watch a costume turn into something else. And that like breath or like giggle or is just like juicy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely saw that in all the details and I love the feather one.
Yeah.
I was like, ooh, yeah, for that. Once you pass into the other side. I don't know. I think my sense of curiosity probably came from Dad a lot, that imagination, or like, and we are curious and we want to be surprised, or you kind of want a scavenger hunt, or so I try to include it as much as I can of like, there's these layers to peel back, but where do they come, or how do we know? I think it happens by accident. And like, as you're working, it's just sort of part of your practice now to like add in that detail or use this little thing or, surprise, right?
Yeah.
A little
Well,
surprise.
and the time to discover, both for yourself with materials, but also when you hand them off to someone else and kind of seeing what they do with them, it's just kind of wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of two questions. One for you, Phoebe. What are surprises that we might see in Sense and Sensibility? What should we be looking for?
Oh man.
Inside scoop.
Inside scoop. Watch out for the horse. No, there are moments where you are meant to see costumes change, like with the horse. And there are moments when you're not supposed to notice the costume change, where it's a narrative move in time. So there are moments where someone walks off stage and walks right back on in something completely different. And you're not supposed to break that narrative of what's happening on stage. It just has to like slide under, and you have to kind of roll with that time.
I'm struck that you both create work that is impermanent and is inevitably going to wear out. How do you feel when it's time to retire work, or it's time to, take down one of your installations?
Yeah. I'm getting better at it. But yeah, like I feel like a little bit greedy, or like it's like I'm building it and I think it will last forever, even though I'm like, I signed a contract for 2 weeks, or like when I found out that the one that was collected, this first sphere, like he called me and was like, it exploded. Like, and I had gone up and like, fixed it up, and over time you have to like patch it up, but it's like, it's pretty devastating. So I want to be like, I'm the Buddha and I'm not attached to anything, but it's devastating to, but it's also sort of trying to accept the reality of mortality, maybe, that like, and trying to honor sustainability, right? Like, I'm trying to intercept bark that's already had one life, get it a second life, then I have to let it go, and but I pretend that I meant to, that I got it under control.
Yeah, I'm curious, because I have the gift of going through that experience with other people. We get to take that breath to celebrate. Do you have that interaction with people who either have or experience your art?
Yeah, I think my favorite story was, like, someone was like, Nikki, turn on NPR, and I'm like, what? And these guys were talking, they were like, what's your favorite place in Denver? And they were like, like someone references breakfast joint, but then the guy was like, there's this little door in a tree. I kid you not, on 17th, and they didn't know. I don't sign my work. So they didn't know that an artist made it or that was installed. But they're like, you have to go to Uptown and find this little intersection, open the door, and in like the little title was "What's your favorite place in Denver?" So I love that it was like it existed, like in wonderment without having to be art or knowing who I was, and I thought. And I don't get to hear it because it's out there, right?
Yeah.
So I don't get to see people in the gallery looking at. So I'm like, gosh, I hope I didn't just, vandalize the tree, which some people argued. And luckily I had some arborists on my team. And that hollow is a very vulnerable spot. So they actually recommend even that you spray foam in there, do anything to protect it. So he's like, actually the sound totems are like a pretty good Band-Aid. And I was like, yes. So
We have time for about one more question if anyone has any final thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about how like both of these different types of art are like very embodied for like the participant or the observer. And so I'm curious, like, is there thought that goes into that before, like, as creating the costumes or creating these like art pieces? Or is that kind of more of like something that just happens and then you reflect on how the person was experienced it?
go ahead.
Sure. I mean, with costumes, it is a very conscious process. Putting clothes on another human is a collaboration. And ultimately, I am not the person who is out there and vulnerable. I am there to support someone else. And so having that communication and that collaboration with performers and with my other colleagues, the other designers, and making sure that people do feel safe in their body is a big part of that process. I'll come into a stage play 6-9 months ahead of opening, whereas performers will only come in 4 weeks, 3 weeks before opening. And so I'll have a longer relationship with the clothes, but ultimately it is a relationship with the performer's person. So it's, a very personal process.
Yeah, hugely interactive. My audience is wider, so not to fit like a single or a few different people. But I mostly think about the scale relative to a human, because you can work in a miniature way or small or human scale if it's the size of a human, or monumentally. And so I'm aware of when you go bigger than a human, that we relate to it differently than if I made the small one in the library, smaller one. And so, but I don't interact with the viewers all the time. So a lot of mine the feedback is coming later. And so I just hope that my expertise is enough to provide like a safe and wonderful experience for the viewers, with scale in mind and how they might experience or touch it, or that you have a choice to open it or not, or but totally different than yours. I have to guess a lot.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's that, because it is that ephemeral work, it's that grace of allowing other people to break it.
Right. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. True.
Well, and one thing I loved hearing both of y'all say was mention the word surprise. And I think when I look at physical art or go to the theater and sing a few TheaterWorks shows now, I'm always like, ooh, look at Phoebe's work. But I'm like, that surprise that you kind of get excited in your chest a little bit, and when something feels really interesting and like oh, I'm having that moment inside. Like that's, I don't know, what makes me love art and have devoted my entire life to art. But at the same time, I'm like, I love how y'all both kind of are coming to a similar thing with your audience, but just in very different capacities. So thank you both.
Sense and Sensibility. Thanks for hosting us. That's fun.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. This was our last Chit Chat of 2024, so please join us in February for our next Chit Chat. I also want to thank our sponsors who help make events like this happen. So we have the Colorado Bank and Trust Company, the Ellen Palmar Foundation, the September 7th Fund, the Janine K. Sheehy Fund, and our Go Group Curator Circle. So if you're interested in being a Curator Circle member, please talk to me, or David can also give you some answers, and you can have your name on our little board outside. But please hang around for a little bit afterwards. Nikki has some prints over here. Please go see Sense and Sensibility and see Phoebe's work. And if you have time tonight, there's some books from our students in the project space. So one night only, go see some handmade photography books. So thank you all.
Thank you.